call this assembly work session to order. We'll start with the roll call. Ms. Kennedy?
Mr. Kennedy.
Pete Peterson. Felix Rivera. Christopher Kingston.
Forrest Dunbar.
Steve Noble with Val.
I'm Sean Holland with the DOT.
Dean Gates.
Great. All right. Let's see. Are there any other assembly members? Is there anyone on the phone? Is the phone on? Okay. All right. Well, I think that you guys have a presentation you're going to give to us. Is that right? All right, please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to kind of kick it off. You know that Felix sent us a draft copy of his resolution in regards to the Midtown Congestion Relief Project, and so the project staff kind of took a look through it and made some suggested markups, I guess. You know, and I guess maybe I'm looking at it as from a glass half full perspective. You know, I look at it as conditional support, and there's some of those conditions in there that we won't be able to meet with public funding. But you know, most of those conditions I think are, you know, they came from the community council resolutions, and I think they're a result of, you know, there's a lot of questions that we can't answer yet with the level of design that we're at. So our plan is just to, you know, continue bringing the community groups along with us and resolving a lot of those conditions. And I didn't see anything in there that, besides those few that we can't do with public funding, I didn't see any of those in there that were all that outside of what our line of thinking was. There are a few things besides the right-of-way stuff that we are going to kind of focus our presentation on. The other thing the resolution kind of told me was that our message has been a little weak in a few spots, and so we know that we can brush up on that. Steve and I had other obligations on Tuesday night, but we were able to make it to the end of the assembly meeting, so there was another resolution there that, it was this resolution, I guess, that was presented. So we made it just in time for that. There wasn't a whole lot of discussion about it, but then when I went back the next day and looked at the video, it looked like there was a fair amount of discussion in regards to the Midtown project for the MTP resolution. And we'd also send in a suggested change to that. But that's, you know, that's part of what we're missing in our message, I think, is that we call it a project. More accurately, it's a planning and environmental linkage study. And you can scale a PEL. You can scale that. You know, you can look at just an intersection, or you can look at a corridor. And you know, our PEL looked at that entire corridor. One of the goals of that PEL was to identify individual projects within that corridor that are going to eventually work with each other to provide benefit. But they're 5 individual projects, and if we built just one of those projects, it would have independent utility and independent benefit. And you know, and then again, after watching that video, we have to strengthen our message a little bit, because I feel like the PEL is consistent with the new paradigm that came up. You know, this part of the projects that we're proposing here, they add significant infrastructure for non-motorized use or active transportation users through that corridor, and even more than are shown in the you know, the current bike and ped plans. We've gone above and beyond that. And the project is also going to alleviate the Seward Highway being a barrier between the residential and the community, or the commercial areas on the west side there. So yeah, I think if we need to bolster our message a little bit, because I think we're consistent with the new paradigm that was discussed there Tuesday night. Well, at this point, I'll turn it over to Steve to run through the slide deck.
Okay, sounds good. I really probably have only about 20 minutes, okay, of slides that we can discuss, and then we can answer any questions and see if there's any refinement to the language that somebody wants to take action on. So, really, we have kind of a 5-point agenda here. We want to talk a little bit about the Seward Highway and the safety and other movement issues that are related to Seward Highway. We want to talk a little about how those projects that Sean just talked about fit into the overall vision. Talk about what we've heard so far, and how that fits into the resolution that's been prepared, and then you know, we've got 3 suggested changes to the resolution that we would like to see incorporated, and then we can have some discussion. So, just a reminder of why we're doing this. You know, this is The Seward Highway specifically and the intersections that are along this stretch of Midtown are some of our most problematic from a safety perspective. In 2018 alone, there were 4 fatalities in the stretch that we're talking about here between our pedestrians and our motorized crashes. If we look at this particular section of Seward Highway, we've got 3 of the top 10 most accident-prone intersections in Anchorage. We've got 3 of the top 10 highest severity crash intersections in Anchorage. We're averaging just in the last 3 years 2 fatalities a year in this corridor. We've got 3 of the top 8 highest volume intersections, number 1, 2, and number 8 in the city. We have no north-south pedestrian corridors along the Seward Highway. All the pedestrian facilities do not meet current standards for ADA accessibility. And there's no way for the pedestrians to be separate from the cars. They have to cross the at-grade crosswalks at Benson, Northern Lights, Fireweed, 36. There's no grade separation anywhere between north of Tudor Road interchange. And those crossings, on average, they're 7 to 9 lanes wide. So they're daunting for pedestrians to get across, and it's a really wide, and pedestrians feel exposed. And it also makes for very long signal cycle lengths as the cars have to. It takes a long time to clear a pedestrian when they do come to the intersection to hit the button. The longer pedestrian times also, because of the width of the intersection, creates a lot of issues there.
I'm going to pause for a moment. We've also been joined by Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you. So all of that kind of getting that in our minds as to really what's driving this project or these projects, and we've spent an extensive amount of public involvement effort kind of trying to decide what is the vision for Midtown and the Seward Highway. And as we've talked about in the past, we've got this simplified graphic that shows Midtown. We're trying to improve access and connectivity for Midtown, improve multimodal access, at the same time trying to improve mobility and decrease access on the Seward Highway itself. But the same vision that we've worked with the public to generate from the beginning has been to improve safety and mobility for all users on the Seward Highway while enhancing our east-west multimodal safety and connectivity and access for Midtown Anchorage. There has been an extensive public outreach effort. We've got a bulletized list of some of our key things that we've done on this study so far. There has been 3 advisory groups, the agency, business, and citizens advisory groups. Those advisory groups continue in force today, and we're going to be continuing them into the next environmental effort that moves forward. We've had 5 meetings each with those groups, so that's 15 meetings. We've also had a large concept screening workshop. We've also had extensive, and as I mentioned, we're going to continue their participation as we move forward. We've had 3 very large open houses at the library where we've had in excess of 100 to 150 citizens come out and check out our project. We've had regular participation at the community council so that we can stay in touch with what are the communities thinking and feeling, and what are their questions. We've gone really above and beyond to make sure that we are not just trying to keep them informed, but also trying to keep ourselves informed on what are the issues important to the community councils. And so I would bet that we've been to at least 50 community council meetings. There's maybe some assembly members have been to more than me in the last 2 years, but besides that, I'm getting pretty close. Then Renee has also been there participating with me. And then we also had because of the potential impacts to the folks on Inger Street, we had an Inger Street gathering. We took our project, the study findings to them. We popped up a tent. We were able to meet with most of the residents, I think, along Inger Street. I thought that was really beneficial and helpful. And we've just had countless one-on-one meetings with folks. And all of that input, I think, prepared us for, and helped us to develop a draft PEL study that was issued November 1st. And we had a 45-day comment period, And we invited the community councils to be able to participate and continue their comment periods well beyond that. And so January and February, we've been getting resolutions from them. But to be honest with you, we haven't had a whole lot of comments, and you might think, well, that means it hasn't been read. I actually think it's more like that the community councils weren't surprised by the findings of the PEL study. We had such an extensive public outreach effort that there weren't surprises in the document. It reflected the input that had been received so far. But the community councils have taken a very active role in developing what I think are unprecedented detail in their resolutions. And in general, those resolutions have been conditional support, and they've identified the things they like and the things they don't like, and the things that are really linchpins for them in continuing to support the projects. The projects that are in the PEL study are summarized here on this slide, which is projects A through E, and you can kind of see the general budgeted cost estimate from a planning perspective on how much those projects would cost. I know you guys have all been through this multiple times before, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. But there are 5 projects. Tudor Road interchange was largely already identified as a project before this study, but it has some modifications based on the recommendations of the PEL study, so that's why it's included in here. But there's really 2 projects each. There's an at-grade, really more shorter term safety and multimodal and congestion related projects at B and C, and then projects D and E come back through after that and create the freeway section that would go through.
No, for the record, we've been driving Mr. Weddleton.
So here's an image of what the Tudor Road interchange might look like, with Tudor Road crossing over the top and Seward Highway going underneath. Here's an image of what the at-grade intersection at Benson and Northern Lights might look like. And what's kind of interesting on this slide is one of the suggestions that was tossed out for in order to create the intersection improvements that we need at these locations. The concept we're talking about is to widen out the intersections, to create really 2 one-way couplets, or one-way couplet in both directions. And so that creates this green space in the middle. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of, I would say maybe even a little bit of angst over that from the community council's perspective on what does that look like. And one of the ideas that's been talked about is maybe it should be a nursery for trees. So that's just why that looks that way. It's just one idea. Maybe it could be who knows what it looks like. I see Chris shaking his head. It could be a variety of different things.
We all know what it would look like under current conditions.
But we do want to make sure that area is activated in some fashion. It's not just it can't just be a green open pasture area. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So projects B and C, they create this frontage road, and we're calling it a frontage road, but it's really the surface street that is Seward Highway today. And that Seward Highway today is 3 to 4 lanes in each direction with no pedestrian facilities. And the new cross section of that road is only 2 to 3 lanes. So the proposal actually narrows up the surface streets that pedestrians have to cross by 1 to 2 lanes in each direction. So we're talking about 2 to 3 lane road with separated pedestrian facilities on both sides of the highway. Projects D and E grade separate or create those bridges, and they depress the freeway. They put a cap over the freeway, and again, activating that green space and that cap over the freeway is still how that would be done is still yet to be determined. And we'll be working with the advisory group on that. That's one of our main projects for this year, is to figure out what does that space look like. Here's another oblique image of what that would look like in its finished condition with the freeway passing underneath. We've got our capped freeway section. We still have this green space between the intersections, between the side streets, and between the couplet essentially that's running in both directions here. One of the things that we're excited to be working on this year is the community placemaking for Midtown. And as fortune would have it, in May of this year, the Pacific region of the creative placemaking leadership organization is having their conference in Anchorage in May of this year. So it's at the Anchorage Museum, and so we're actually going to piggyback onto that conference. We've been in touch with those folks, and we're going to have a day conference where we're going to be able to engage our advisory group with those folks to brainstorm and really try to improve and see what their take is on this project and get some ideas for how and then we'll use that effort to really kick off and get our placemaking concept going for the Midtown area. And we would actually invite anybody who wants to participate. We're going to make that open for people to participate. If there's any assembly members that would like to participate in that placemaking workshop, we'd love to have you. We plan to have probably 3 to 4 meetings this year and 3 to 4 meetings probably next year too with that advisory group to really hammer out what that looks like. Excuse me. So after construction, what are some of the things that we can that this corridor will be able to? What changes are going to occur? I think number one, we'll be able to resolve the crash frequency and severity in the corridor. We won't kill as many people on an annual basis because of the design of the road. We'll have 5 pedestrian bridges or underpasses in an area where we currently have none. We'll have pedestrian crossings that are 1 to 2 lanes shorter than any of the existing crossings. We'll have north, south, and east-west multi-use pathways on all of the cross streets and on the Seward Highway. We'll have a 4-lane depressed, partially capped freeway section at least from Benson to Fireweed. And we're going to change Seward Highway from the 45-mile-an-hour no driveway access corridor really to a slower speed commercial access arterial through Midtown. We are going to be creating a lot of green space in the corridor, and how that gets activated and utilized is yet to be figured out. But we think there's a great opportunity for enhancing the Midtown City Center. We know because there's no noise mitigation at all in the current Seward Highway corridor, and so the neighborhoods have no protection from the highway noise right now. And in addition to that, many of the neighborhoods have no even physical barriers between them and the Seward Highway. The folks that live along on the west side of Ingram Street, many of those homeowners talk about routine problems that they have with security issues. So we're confident that there will also be quieter and more secure neighborhoods that could result from the improvements. And last but not least is we will also be able to underground most of the overhead utilities that are there. There's one of the higher voltage transmission lines that we're probably not going to be able to underground, but everything else should be able to be underground. So what have we heard? We've heard from the community councils. We've got resolutions from Airport Heights, Fairview, Rogers Park, and Tudor area, all expressing what we would categorize as conditional support for the projects, assuming certain elements are included in the project. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, is that support. We realize that support is based on a few certain things. We've also heard concerns about the Glen to Seward Highway PEL corridor study. That's been one of the most common concerns that we've heard expressed along from the results of the PEL so far. So those conditional elements that we heard from those resolutions, these things have to be included in the plan, or else we're going to lose that support. We have to have a depressed freeway. They want us to coordinate the design for the entire corridor before we start construction. They want to make sure that the residents know what's happening from Tudor to 20th before we start any one individual project. They want us to tightly sequence the construction so that we don't have a long period between the completion of the surface street improvements at 36th and at Benson, Norlights, and Fireweed, and when the freeway, capped freeway section has gone through. They want us to lower the speeds in the corridor for it to feel like more of a commercial access corridor. Strong support for a new bridge at Chester Creek for both the creek and for the pedestrian undercrossing. strong advocacy for continuing the discussions with the folks on Ingram Street and Geneva Woods to make sure that we mitigate their concerns and address and mitigate the impacts to their neighborhood. And then a strong advocacy that a comparable study for the Seward Highway north of 15th Avenue, that also occur to mitigate potential impacts to the neighborhood north of 20th Avenue that could result from improvements in Midtown. So we've identified, okay, so all of those things except for maybe the coordinating the design, all of those things are included in the Anchorage Assembly resolution. And I also just want to point out that all of those things are also in the PEL study recommendations. So we really are on the same page with a lot of those things. The department has included virtually all of those conditional elements in there. And what about Fairview? What about PEL north of this corridor? I feel like a little bit of a broken record. I've been telling Chris for a long time that study is coming, and sometimes it starts to ring hollow, but I can tell you that I've checked with DOT, and Kelly Summers is the DOT project manager, and that plan is proposed to be advertised right now. That's looking like the first or second week of April. Hopefully it'll be out on the street. And that really means that it would start in earnest probably by June or July of this year. It's likely to be a 2-year process, and it will have a comparable, if not more extensive public outreach effort than we had on the Midtown job. So all that lays the groundwork for, okay, so we've established what the common ground is on the resolution, but there's 3 things that we'd like to talk to you about, and maybe it's a matter of how we were interpreting them or reading them, but we would like to get, we've actually got some revised language that we would recommend for the resolution, and specifically the 3 things are deal with the traffic model, the mature trees on the east side of Seward Highway, and then the home values along Ingram Street. As written, the Assembly resolution talks about updating the model using the Department of Labor statistics, and from a transportation perspective, what we would prefer, or what we would suggest happen instead, to make sure that we're being consistent as a municipality, is that we add the whereas that talks about the fact that the Metropolitan Transportation Plan actually just finished. And it's being finished. It's very closely being done. The MTP model was just updated, and so we would suggest that existing and committed traffic model that was developed by AMATS, that be the model that we use for the starting point for the environmental and design analyses moving forward. The problems with using the Department of Labor is that then we would end up with a traffic model that was, first of all, we'd have to go back and redo a bunch of work to create a new traffic model. And then secondly, there's no real standard for how that would be created. And we would end up with a traffic model for 1.5 miles of the Seward Highway that was different than the rest of the municipality. And the Department of Labor, and there's kind of standards of practice for how those models are to be created based on a lot more detail than what's in the Department of Labor statistics, based on population, land use, density, all those things that really play into generating a more robust and believable traffic model. That's what goes into that MTP. And when we look at that as a whole for the entire municipality, that's what we would recommend. Then we have a document. Then we will have projects that are consistent and don't have conflicts from adjacent projects. The next one is related to Clause 1F, which talks about, quote unquote, leaving the trees that are on the east side of Ingram Street untouched. So to make sure that we are all on the same page here, and this one, it really maybe it's how we're interpreting what you're writing there, but the trees that are on the east side of Ingram Street could mean between Ingram Street and Seward Highway, or it could mean just on the private property adjacent to Ingram Street. We're not really sure what that fully meant, but the trees that are in that buffer area between the Seward Highway and the property line that are in that property owned by the municipality, those trees that are those mature, that kind of 100-foot wide stretch or 75-foot wide stretch of trees that's on the back side of the private property, that stretch of trees is proposed to be cleared under all of the concepts. The mature trees that are on the private property, if we impact those private property, we agree that we will do everything we can to preserve those mature trees that are on any private properties that had to be acquired, because we want to preserve those from a visual standpoint for the homes that are on the west side or on the east side of English Street. And so, particularly in light of the utility undergrounding that needs to be done, that tree buffer between the private property and the Seward Highway, that clearing is, we don't have much of a choice there. But on the private property, we would agree that to the extent possible, clearly to the extent possible, the numerous mature trees that are on the west side of English Street would be preserved. The last one here talks about the home values, and as the current document is written, it talks about how the homeowners that are on the east side of English Street, that they would be compensated for losses to their home values that could result from this, or that the department would have to explain why that's I forget the exact language, but pull it up here. Or given justification as why the project will not impact their home values. So we have proposed some language here that would address this in a similar way. And honestly, this goes a little bit back to the way that Sean was talking about. We prefer to look at this from a glass is half full perspective. It's fully our intent to make sure that there are not home value impacts to the properties on the east side of English Street that would result from this project. And we're gonna take the steps necessary to make sure that doesn't happen. We are actually going to try to make sure that we're going to do our best to enhance that neighborhood. We're talked about having noise mitigation. We talked about having the barrier. There would be a new barrier there that would provide a more defensible neighborhood for that community. And so what we're talking about here is language that we would propose to say residents on the east side of English Street will continue to have interaction with the project team. We're going to involve those folks in our project to help DOT avoid impacts to their neighborhood character and feel that could impact their property values. And the DOT will commit to developing landscape plans and project amenities that enhance the quality of life for English Street residents by improving security, reducing noise, and incorporating aesthetic elements into the design. So, to be honest, there really is not a. This goes back to another thing Sean said about not being able to do things with public funds. There really is not a protocol or a practice for how to appraise and compensate for negative impacts to private property that result from projects. And it's kind of either all or nothing. You know, you either acquire them in full or you don't acquire them and you mitigate impacts to those properties so they don't have those kind of impacts. And so that's the approach that we would like to incorporate in here. It's better to approach this in a more proactive way, use our placemaking concepts, developing landscape plans. And really, there's going to be numerous opportunities because of, if there's right-of-way acquisition, we're going to have to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission, we're going to have to go to UDC. There's a lot of things we're going to have to do, steps we're going to have to take here to get concurrence that we're not impacting that neighborhood in a negative way before we'll get approval to do the construction. And I don't know. So that's why we would suggest this revised language. And this is a little bit different, Felix, than the language that we gave you. We can send you a Word version with the proposed changes for these three. There's a handful of other changes that are in the resolution that we would like to see changed that are kind of more minor issues, but these are the three big ones that really matter to us. Mostly because we don't want to, honestly, we would rather not be in a situation where we're in conflict with your resolution. We want to make sure that we're following it, and 90% of what's there we're able to adhere to is just these three issues. A slight tweak on the language there would enable us to stay in compliance with it. So
Okay, so questions? Thank you. All right, so Mr. Constant and then Mr. Peterson.
some questions. A question. Your slide that listed the 3 high-impact intersections, where are the other 7? Do you know? Intersections that have the highest human to vehicle impacts.
If you give me a second, I can pull up the list. Yes.
All right, thank you. Interesting. I thought that we had one of the whereases in here that didn't speak to coordinating the projects through the Midtown, but also through Fairview. So maybe we need another amendment there. First, a little story about traffic models. In 2013, when Fairview went to the legislature, secured funding for a project that would reclaim Gamble Street as their neighborhood main street. The funding was received, the traffic analysis was done using the MTP model, traffic models, and it proved that you could take Gamble, convert it to a 2-way road, only needing one left-hand turn lane at one intersection to keep the level of service where it was. And Ken Morton, the region lead, actually said to us, when we proved using the model that it could be done, well, our model must be flawed then. So it doesn't matter what claims are made about models. DOT is going to make the claims that they want, and they're going to drive to get their solution using whatever rationale they need to.
Well, you know, Ken Morton's not there anymore, but I guess from my perspective, that's the tool that we have to work with is the AMATS model. So, you know, and again, I tried to tell you the other night that I'm a project guy, I'm not a policy guy, so it's inappropriate for me to, I have opinions on policy, but it would be a different setting. I can't speak to it sitting here representing DOT. But on our project, I feel like we need to be consistent with the AMATS model.
No, and I appreciate that. It works when it supports your cause, not you, the department's cause, to say we need to follow our model, but then if it doesn't match the paradigm that the department wants, they say the model must be broken.
And
I have seen that.
You have different management.
I have seen that firsthand, though.
Yeah.
So that is not secondhand, that is firsthand experience. As to the question of compensation and how you can't come up with an amount and that you can only mitigate the impacts, it's all or nothing, this then actually drives the kind of important step up to the 10,000 foot view and look down at Fairview in relationship to Midtown. So we've bumped back 5 years and 5-year chunks and 2 years and 2-year chunks more when the downtown is going to be dealt with. We've leapfrogged over it to go to Midtown, and now you're asking the Midtown neighbors to accept that we're going to do this differently than we did in downtown Fairview. And what I mean by that is Fairview has been left standing and waiting for resolution for this problem for 40 years. Right? And so what promise can be made to the people of Midtown when you come and start stripping their neighborhood of the peace that they have now with the promise of some better day, that the economy's not going to change, that the model's not going to change, that they're going to be sitting there in the middle of the project, and then it's actually never going to conclude, but what is going to happen is the taking of the assets of the neighborhood, and they'll be left with what you did in the Fairview corridor. Not you personally again. This is much bigger than us, right?
Yeah, you don't have to copy it. But
I just don't want you to think I'm attacking you, but really that's the fear that I am experiencing and hearing. It's like PTSD for me because I've been through this before. But now I'm hearing these neighbors asking the same question. Why in the world would we go through this process, expand this massive taking, and then wait for the failed promise that it's almost inevitable if you look at past performance, that we're going to be left with Midtown now being just like Fairview? How do we
Things have
avoid
changed
it?
a lot in the last 50 years. You know, there's Uniform Right-of-Way Act, which is not the full title of that act, but that's what we follow today. Probably didn't follow it 50 years ago. You know, and we're working with the best information that we have today. You know, it's there's none of these projects are in the funding program yet, in the statewide transportation improvement program. They aren't listed in the new draft that's due to come out here in the next month or so. You know, our next hope is the First Amendment that's anticipated around August. Right now we're operating on state money. I think it's a 2012 appropriation, the title of which is Midtown Traffic Congestion Relief, which kind of drove the title of our PEL. But yeah, I guess my point is that I'm confident that we can we'll get something built, you know, and maybe I'm overly optimistic. It's not gonna happen until we get construction funding, but we're working with the best information that we have today.
And that's a fair assessment, but there have been lots of todays between 1950 and now in Fairview.
Mhm.
And today just, you know, what's that song, Someday Never Comes? Someday never comes.
And you know, and you and I talked about it a little bit there on Tuesday night, is that, you know, my history with highway to highway goes back to the Glen Pergaw interchange, and I kind of thought we'd just keep marching and building that connection, and we haven't. So again, I can't speak to policy, but I support that connection personally. And you know, if it's in the MTP and we're moving forward with that PEL, then, you know, I'm hoping that if we get something built here, we can build traction to get something built throughout the corridor.
So,
and in that highway to highway, remember that, you know, there's several different alternatives that were looked at, but all the alternatives between Tudor and 20th, I mean, this corridor was chosen pretty carefully, that all those alternatives between Tudor and 20th are on the same alignment, and that's the alignment that we're working.
so there's no answer to the question of how the neighbors could be confident in the fact that the promises being made, that the harms will be mitigated, that they won't be left lost. But I can show you $2 billion of property that has suffered, and no relief.
Like I said, we have requirements in the Uniform Act today that we didn't have 50 years ago.
I would like, if you don't mind, then maybe following up this week, before our meeting next week, kind of an explanation of those policies and how they differ.
Mhm.
Would be very helpful. And one last question, it might lead to a couple sub-questions, but I understand there is a PEL guidebook that's kind of nearing completion.
Yes.
There is.
Yeah.
So would you argue that this project is in alignment with the standards that are being published in the guidebook?
I would say so. You know, there's many other states that have guidebooks. We use kind of an amalgam of those different guidebooks. And to be honest with you, I can't, or to be frank with you, I can't tell you that we're exactly mirroring what that handbook is going to say. I've seen the draft, and I haven't noticed anything that we're doing any differently. But yeah, we're kind of working on that parallel, so I can see that there's probably going to be some differences, minor, I would assume.
So would it surprise you to contemplate that there might be some resistance to adopting support of the NCR PEL until the handbook is delivered?
No, I mean, I personally don't see the point in that. Like I said, we've used federal guidance, we've used guidance books from other states. I feel like we have pretty good guidance to put that PEL together. There's been other PELs put together in the state, not in Central Region, but without that guidebook, and that were successful.
And it may very well be there's an amendment to this resolution that calls for at least a completion of that guidebook and its application to this process before support would be forthcoming. That would just possibly be an amendment.
If you have anything specific that you...
No, it's hard for us to know if we're getting a fair deal here without having a standard, and if the state's about to publish a standard, it might be reasonable to apply the process to the standard instead of investing in the biggest transportation project we're going to see in the next 25 years and then allowing the handbook to be published that gives guidance on how the process should be done. And so to me, there's an argument to be said for at least having some kind of an analysis of this process in relationship to the standards that are near completion in the guidebook. But that's just a thought.
I'm gonna.
Yep.
So I have a couple other people in the queue. Mr. Peterson, and then Ms. LaFrance, and then were you in the? John, were you in? Okay, and Mr. Rivera. Go ahead, Pete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just was wondering, you're talking about utilities being undergrounded. Are the utilities aware of this project, and is the cost of the undergrounding an expense that they would normally have to pay as part of their continuing projects to underground more of the utilities, or is that part of the cost of this project?
We have had utility coordination meetings, planning meetings with all of the utility companies, and we've estimated their costs based on those meetings with them. And it's right now we're including it in our budget for the overall project. It wouldn't be a burden that would be placed on those utilities directly unless they put betterments as part of their work. You know, some of those utilities have undergrounding requirements as part of their funding, and so there may be some contribution towards that. But the level of undergrounding that we're talking about here is probably beyond what those folks do on an annual basis, and so it would be largely a project-driven expense. You agree?
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So 3 questions. One for the sponsors. I assume you guys are going to continue to work through, I think I heard Mr. Constance say possible amendments as far as the points of difference with what we're hearing.
We
Yes.
certainly have their language now. We'll take it into consideration.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, second question, apologies for being late. Could you give a quick recap of the time frame in terms of where this fits with, I know it's not yet on the STIP, and how long it would take to get on that, and when funding would be available? And then the third question, is there any way for, or does DOT ever do MOUs, memorandums of understanding with local governments? I know people are feeling kind of burned with some cost shifting where the state and federal projects, right, have resulted in the muni needing to put forward, a bunch of money to address some traffic issues that were driven by, the state projects. And so I'm wondering, along the same lines of timing, is there any kind of formal assurance that, Mr. Constance residents too could have about project completion? And I know that the STIP can change within administration, and that funding is not set in stone, and so recognize that you all are dealing with those issues too. So that was the last 2 questions kind of blended into one, a quick time frame overview, and is there any way to have some kind of formal MOU, like with the MOA or residents? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Fritz.
I think that the time frame, the time frame question is a hard one to answer, because I mentioned that currently there's no funding in the statewide spending plan for it. If we had funding, we could build the entire project in less than 10 years. But yeah, I don't think we could really answer that question right now of when we could start with our first project. We're, like I said, I'm hopeful that we'll get some design funding in the August amendment to the STIP. But I was also hopeful that it would show up in the draft STIP that's going to be published during the next month, and it was not. So.
The other thing I would add to the timeline, just from a near-term perspective, is that the environmental phases for some of these first efforts that we're going to be working on over the next couple of years, that is going to take a couple of years for projects B and C, the environmental tasks for those first projects. That there won't be, at the same time, the PEL study for Fairview, or it's called Seward to Glen PEL is actually the name of it. That PEL is going to get kicked off this summer. So the recommendations of that study are likely to be known by the time the environmental documents are done for the projects B and C that are here. And so we're not likely to have any real construction starting in this corridor before we know what the impacts are going to be and what the projects and recommendations are going to be for north of 20th Avenue. So these projects take time to develop, and there's time to for some of the other ongoing things to resolve themselves at the same time that the environmental documents might be being done on this other stuff. So,
in our state appropriation, we probably have enough funding to get through the environmental document phase. It'll be tight, but for the projects. So the next 2 years. Second question regarding the MOUs. Yeah, they're very, very common that the DOT will have MOUs with the local government, and essential on this project. The impacts or the benefits, are going to be largely to the city streets, and this is just too tightly tied together to try to do that independently. That's, again, I don't know that I mentioned that at the outset, but in my perspective anyway, it's critical that we have at the Assembly's, I don't know if I say approval, but support, I guess, for the project, so that's the reason why we're here.
And we're not in the same situation. It seems like you might be making reference to the Scooter Drive. That project had, and the situation where the department was doing one part of the project and had an agreement with the city that they would do another part of the project. That, if we ended up in that situation, it would be different, but right now, everything that we're included in the projects, we're including, it's all part of what we're planning to be part of the state project, not, it doesn't try to shift some of that off to the local municipality.
Thank you.
Did you have a third part of your question, Mrs. France, or is that?
No, actually, Mr. Chair, that covered it.
Okay,
Thanks.
great, thank you. Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, a few comments and then questions. So, first, I, on slide 4, really appreciate that there's such a focus on pedestrian improvements. That's one of the things that my community councils particularly want to see, and they right now aren't. They want to make sure that there's a focus on prioritizing funding for those, rather than prioritizing funding for roads, for cars to be able to go through faster. Second is, I would temper your comments regarding support from community councils. I would say at most it's non-objection, because there's a lot of information that that the community councils want that they aren't able to get right now. So they're commenting on what they can comment. But once they get more information, then the comments might appear very different than what you're getting right now. Second, and Mr. Constant said this on slide 10, I would highly suggest removing those trees from that graphic until you are able to deliberate that a little bit more and talk with the community councils on that. Then getting to specifics on your recommendations. So on slide 20, the recommendation on the traffic model. So, currently there is a lack of trust from the community councils in the traffic model. One of the things that the community councils, I assume, aren't aware of is that the traffic model is being updated. I think when I talked about it at the Rogers Park Community Council, they made the assumption that it was still the 2016 data that's being used. So could you tell me the latest traffic model, what data is being used, and then can you go and talk to the community councils about that? Because this is something that they want to engage in, for sure.
So, it's a complex issue, to be honest with you, and I don't have all the information at my fingertips. But what I can tell you is that the 2016, 2017 models that had been run was what we were basing our initial work on, because that's all we had to work from. And there's not enough budget to go recreate an all-new municipality of Anchorage traffic model for every project, because people think that the conditions have changed. So that's why we have a municipality-wide traffic model and by statute, by federal requirement, it has to be updated every 5 years. That unfortunately we did not have that model to work from when we did the PEL study, but we can't stop all projects and wait till it gets done, otherwise we wouldn't be doing projects every 5 years. So we were using the best available information that we had. But I would say that we can certainly, as part of the work going forward, we can take the MTP model that's been created, that just recently updated with, and honestly, we didn't create it. AMAT's created it, so I don't have all the information specifically what's included in there, but we certainly we can work with AMAT's to come give a community council presentation on what the assumptions are that are in that AMAT's model. They just had a public meeting on this in Mountain View not 3 weeks ago, and they gave a presentation, so I'm sure we could ask them to come give a similar presentation to the community councils,
Sure.
And then that would give them the detail that they need. It's a frustrating thing as a transportation professional. It's frustrating that more people don't get engaged in the MTP process. There might have been 20 people at that meeting for an entire municipality of Anchorage traffic model, but people don't engage in it. But they do engage on it on the project level, and they want you to. So that's something that we've got to work on how to fix.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I think the councils would appreciate that. Like I said, I think there's a general lack of trust in the model. And then last comment on slide 22. So, I guess just to reiterate a little bit of what Mr. Constant was saying, this idea of all or nothing in that the impacts are going to be mitigated by placemaking, landscape, and all of these other things. But it's hard to imagine that is going to make up for a loss evaluation in your home of $100,000 because now there's this big highway that's right next to your home. So how is placemaking, effectively reducing noise, creating livable space, going to make up for that $100,000 loss in valuation? So I think, to me, this slide 22 is shortchanging my residents and my constituents, and so I'm going to have a hard time accepting this revision, but I'll consider it.
Okay, let's see here. Mr. Weddleton, okay.
I just had one. Chris had asked me what the other top 10 were.
Yeah, Chris.
That's all I can tell you. So over the last 3 years,
Are they ranked, by the way?
They are ranked.
Okay, so are you going?
So
10
number
to
one is C Street and 6th Avenue. Number 2 is 36th and Seward Highway. Number 3 is Boniface and Northern Lights Boulevard. Number 4 is Boniface and DeBar Road. Number 5 is Braga and DeBar. Number 6 is Northern Lights Boulevard and Lake Oaks Parkway. Number 7 is 6th and Gamble. Number 8 is Benson and Seward Highway. Number 9 is Airport Heights and Glen Highway. And number 10 is Northern Lights and Seward Highway.
Interesting, I didn't hear Carlin third on there.
I wonder if it's considered
3 years of data.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll definitely look into that.
I wonder if that's not considered an intersection at the same time. Anyway, or maybe they're like not an intersection.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. Sounds like we've got a problem along the bar. So, Mr. Weddleton.
Okay, thanks. Just a comment, a couple questions. We'll get your head on it. But on the house valuation, it's hard to say if they drop or who knows what'll happen. But essentially, at South Anchorage, I've been surprised that we've actually built some really high-end houses right up against the highway. If you go down, I know Melinda Freeman lives on what's called, but it's kind of the east side of Kempton Hills and so on. And Geneva Woods has some really expensive houses there that were built after the highway was right there. It surprises me in this town. Usually you have to jump next to the highway to get better. Anyway, so who knows how it'll affect them. I had a question. So it's not in the STIP, but the PELs for this and the Fairview are in the STIP. Is that correct?
The PEL for the next Seward to Glen connection is in the STIP. We're operating on state funds. 2012.
So this
general
project had to be in there, and then the other one is in there, but the big project isn't. Is that
Right.
what I heard?
Yeah. There's no
So-
construction funding in the
Okay.
state.
So when does a PEL go stale? Because if you're going to fund that PEL, you better have anticipation to have.
I think it's in code. I think it's 5 years until you start the NEPA process, but I'm not sure. It's
So-
5 years until something. It's either you complete the NEPA process or start the NEPA process. I feel like it's start the NEPA process.
What's your span for the STIP? Is that just this
It's
year?
3 years.
3 years. So,
It's updated every year.
okay, so it's not. I mean, there's got to be some assumption. that this
And there's
will be in
amendments.
there.
It does. There's amendments as we go. As
Right.
it moves along.
For the STIP, do they do like we do with the 20-year?
Yeah, there's a long-range transportation.
There is a long range, and are these in that?
The STIP usually only covers 6 years. It's got the first 3, and then it's got the next 3, which are usually more illustrative. So you really, the STIP is much more short-term on how we're going to spend money over the next 3 years.
Quick point of order, Mr. Chair. I'd like to make a motion to extend by 10 minutes.
Got a second? Okay, any opposition to that motion?
Can I get a couple more?
Okay, what's that?
Yeah.
I think that was intent, yeah.
Yes.
But yes, you can keep going, sir, Mr. Weldon.
Okay.
That wasn't entirely for you, but yes.
No, it's okay.
Other people.
No, these will be quick. I just think
Those are the
these are
personal
quick.
attack.
So, you said it would be tightly sequenced construction. So, how do you know that if it's not in the STIP? How do you?
We'll be throttled by our funding, right?
Right.
We would like to sequence it as tightly as we can, but, you know, be throttled by funding.
So we really don't know. It could be these changes are done and that covers 10, 15
But
years.
like I said, I missed the outset, but what I said was
is
that
infinity years away.
we've identified 5 different projects that have independent utility and independent benefit. So if we build one of those projects, it's going to have an independent utility and it's going to provide some independent benefit.
Okay, and then that leads to the scoffing over here. How do you guarantee, we have that depressed highway here, but that's way expensive. And at some point, you know, I mean, our culture still says move cars fast. Just put a big overpass. That's what we do in this country. Why don't we just do that? And that's going to be in the discussion always.
I don't know that that's really what we do anymore. You know, a national trend is to, well, it could be a long conversation, but I'd say the national trend would be to look like what we're proposing here, more than put an overpass.
Can you tell me some examples? Austin.
You know what? I've looked at, they're all over the country, but one of the projects that I've looked at that helped me with my vision for Midtown is the banks in Cincinnati. I've never been there, you know, but someone suggested that I look at it, and it's, if you look at it, doesn't have covers over it, but it's kind of similar in my mind. It's similar to what the vision I have for Midtown is, and it's the same type of thing. You know, they have the mixed use has grown on one side of the highway. The highway's depressed. There's frontage roads on top, and there's residential on the other side.
The other thing, John, is that there's an environmental process that will proceed for each of these projects, and that environmental process will go through an alternatives analysis, and it will build on what we've done so far, and the alternatives analysis that's been done as part of the PEL will feed into that alternatives analysis for the environmental documents. As long as we do it in the next 5 years, then we can reuse that information. But I guess my point being is that the environmental document is really when those final decisions get made. And if the NEPA document says it goes down and is depressed and it goes down, then that's what's going to happen, unless they redo the entire process again and go out to the public and say, all right, we're gonna instead we're not going to do what you said to do. We're going to elevate it. There would have to be an extensive public process and a redo of the environmental process to change the highway to go over. We just can't do that anymore. We can't approve one thing with the environmental document and the public process and go build something else. That can't be done anymore.
And we have enough experience with our community groups that I'm not going to be the one to even suggest that, you know. So it would never fly with the community.
Is that all, Mr. Weldon?
Yeah, thank you.
I have 2 quick questions, and then we'll go to you, Mr. Constant. So you talked about slowing down the speeds on the Seward Highway. At what stage does that happen, and could you do that before you even started this process? I mean, so Tudor, for example, every community council along Tudor that I'm involved in has asked repeatedly to slow down the speed, particularly along the Muldoon curve. In that area, it's 50 miles an hour. It's faster than anywhere else that goes east-west in the city. And it has caused a number of fatal crashes, and they've said it over and over and over, slow it down, and the DOT refuses to do it. So how could the people in Midtown believe that you're actually going to slow this down when your track record is you do not slow down these kind of roads?
We're installing those two-phase signals as part of this project.
So it's not slowing down the. Are you going to slow down the speed limit as well,
Yeah.
or just the okay?
Posted 35. Yeah.
Could you do that first?
Not without installing we wouldn't get the efficiency without installing the two-phase signals first.
But you get the safety. Okay, and my other question is kind of a big one, then I'll feed into Mr. Constant's points. Is you have Fairview sort of crying out, and my impression goes most through Mr. Constant, but it appears you have Fairview crying out for a solution. Please let us do this, and then you have Midtown very hesitant to do what you're asking to do, and perhaps they will go along. How did the Midtown hesitancy jump the line and get before the Fairview? This is the biggest project we're going to have in decades. How did the mega project that people want get leapfrogged by the mega project that people are very concerned about?
And again, you're dipping into policy, which I don't know the answer, but it's not appropriate for me to speak to policy in this setting. But what I can say is I don't really know. I know that there's a 2012 appropriation that defines the limits of this project. I have no idea why it was picked over Fairview. It makes sense to me personally that if you're going to try to make that sewer line connection, that you would start from the outside and work your way in. You're not going to start from the middle and work your way out. But that's my personal thought. You know, I'm not sure why it was chosen first.
Mr. Constant.
Thank you. So a few things. I'll try to be brief. Just to note for the record, someone I know and respect from the DOT department is here, who is a policymaker, Jim Amundsen, the Central Region Design Chief. So he's been here for the whole meeting. And if you're looking for examples of the good faith of DOT's efforts spanning from the highway to highway to now, the Fairview Community Council would offer, if you look at this single piece of property at the corner of 14th and Ingra on the northwest corner, it has been a deteriorated property since the highway to highway quit. And if you go up and read the little tiny writing on the sign, it says, "Stay off, this is DOT property." That property was taken in furtherance of the project in the past. That project got wiped off the books. Here we are looking how we're going to move forward. And the promise now is, we're going to get there, because we'd have to do a whole other study if we wanted to change something. But the fact is, we're now in the next phase of a study that dropped the ball from the previous iteration, and we're still left with the scars in the neighborhood. So that's reality. That's like the math, arithmetic, as Bill Clinton would say. I would love to hear from the folks who are from the impacted neighborhoods. We have at least two groups here, someone from the Ingra and kind of Fireweed area, and then we have someone from the Fairview side. And so I would like to hear from both of them if they have any concerns to add to this conversation that haven't been laid on the table yet. So it can be either Ms. Alter or Ms. Need.
Hi, thanks,
Just start.
Altel, Inver Street resident, for the record. So specifically, we have concerns about changing. Well, I live on the east side of Inver Street, so my family will remain on Inver Street regardless of the right-of-way. We want a right-of-way plan on Inver Street. We've been told it won't come until 65% design. That's pretty far into the project, and it leaves a lot of uncertainty for us. We are also concerned that the NEPA process and looking at the alternatives can't take into account the Fairview PEL as it's coming, and then we're going to have a connection point that is going to be right near our neighborhood, where our neighborhood ends. And the MCR PEL is valid for 5 years, so we would caution and ask to wait to start the NEPA process until the Fairview PEL is done. And then the improvements we're being told that will help us on Inver Street actually could happen now without a giant project. We would love a sound barrier wall without having to widen the highway. We are one of the few neighborhoods that don't have that at a major highway. Similarly, pedestrian crossings, why can't we just add pedestrian crossings across the highway? Inver Street residents cross the highway a lot. We walk into Midtown. That is a big part of why we live where we live. Similarly, multimodal pathways, north-south along the highway. Right now we have the space. We have a buffer, in fact, there and available. Why don't we just do that? And to Mr. Dunbar's point, why don't we just slow down the highway now? These seem to be all big improvements we could make other than committing to a $200 million highway. And that will impact my street significantly. My daughter's best friend lives on the west side of the street. The only other family of color that lives on my street is on the west side of the street. My neighbors are in their 80s on the west side of the street. This will have a significant impact on this street with people who have lived there for decades and decades and call it home. And we're going to be undergoing construction for at least a decade. It'll take about 10 years to build. That is disruptive to our neighborhood and our quality of life. On the resolution itself, I would recommend one change on page 2 as it talks about taking this about the sound barrier at line 44,
that it be constructed and landscaped concurrent with right-of-way acquisition, not shortly after, to ensure that if right-of-way acquisition is taken and houses are removed, that we do get a sound barrier right away, so we are not open and exposed to the highway. Thank you.
Mr. Need.
Hi, Perry Need, for the record, past president of Fairview Community Council, and I was on the Citizens Advisory Group for the MCR Health. But echo my neighbor's plea that the Fairview Pal is completed before the NEPA process on the MCR. That they are concurrent. I think that you would run into danger of segmentation in the NEPA process, failing into segmentation if you were to look at these two independent. And I think if the right-of-way is taken and then the NEPA process fails or it's not funded, you're going to end up with a situation very similar to Fairview where if you want to see what inverse condemnation looks like, I encourage you to walk down the street with me, and if you can hear yourself think, you'll see the deterioration of the properties in that area where the uncertainty from the ability to invest in that neighborhood exists. And finally, I'd like to highlight something I think I heard Mr. Constant say, which was about elevating the priority of that PEL guidebook. We have two of the biggest potential planning and investment projects that Anchorage may see in our lifetime happening right now without necessarily having a full understanding of what the state standard is for this sort of work. That document is complete. It's in a final draft. It's just not being released by DOT right now. I think there's an inflection point where this assembly could maybe ask DOT to release that document in good faith, then compare it to the existing PEL, the MCR PEL, and then apply it to the Fairview PEL. This is one of the things in there I think I heard Mr. Holland say was that he was not aware of any difference. So, there's no reason to hold on to that PEL guidebook anymore. And then the one difference that I think I'm aware of from my understanding of that guidebook is, and maybe this is a question to Mr. Holland, but is that PELs are run by planning in an ideal world, not by engineering. That this is a planning process, that this is not an engineering project. And I think that when you have planners running a planning process as opposed to engineers running a planning process, you may have an opportunity for different outcomes and different objectives, particularly land use coming into play as a significant consideration regarding what that project's going to do. So those are my brief comments, and thank you very much.
John, very, very briefly.
I don't quite understand, you want the PL done for Fairview before this is initiated. I mean, it's not like they would build two roads that don't line up or anything. I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong. I don't understand.
I think that we don't have a guarantee that they won't build two roads that don't line up until we have the two plans sitting next to each other and the NEPA process going through with that combined corridor. I think that there's a high likelihood that you could end up creating a fire hose of traffic into the Fairview neighborhood with a completed plan in the Midtown that Fairview has not been able to plan or construct any sort of accommodation for. And I think that because these two plans are being looked at independently, there's a high likelihood of a protest at the NEPA process for these two plans being considered independently and not together. And I think
just a quick interjection. I have an email from the project lead for the downtown, the Glenda Seward PEL, that essentially told Fairview that the scale and scope of their vision isn't justified by the traffic levels now or to the planning horizon. And so the same numbers were used to justify an amazing transformation of a neighborhood with clover leaves and lanes piling in together, finally an undercut. Somehow, magically, the numbers stop at Chester Creek. And so, to me, there is a problem with the reason, the logic behind that decision making, where if they're going to shut off the flow of design because they can't anticipate it's going to grow, then that's proof that we have a disconnection between the two visions. And that's where the failure of the environmental is going to come to play, I think.
Okay, well, we have to close this work session, and we will hear this resolution on the 10th of March.